Hey everyone, Tactics here, and in this video I wanted to talk a bit about Guardian Druid after the recent massive buffs the spec received both to their damage as well as a few talents. I've been playing the spec a lot in Mythic Plus over this past weekend, so I figured I'd give you all of my thoughts on how the spec is looking now and where it falls compared to some of the other tank specs. If you're not familiar with the buffs, I made a whole video going over that, so I'll link that down below and also probably make it pop up as well, so go check that out first, but otherwise let's get right into it, starting with how this changes Guardian Druid rotationally. Right off the bat, way more of your damage is coming from non-Moonfire related sources since it wasn't affected by this buff, so things like Thrash, things like Mangle, and most importantly, Maul are making up significantly larger portions of your overall damage. Maul especially has had a massive jump in priority, in particular whenever you get one of those Tooth and Claw procs. It just makes Maul hit so hard and be free to cast, so you kind of want to press it up to even 6 targets, sometimes more if you're running Vicious Cycle. What this does do is actually give Guardian a decent amount of priority target damage even in AoE pulls, and that's not even taking into account any of the defensive benefits that Tooth and Claw provides. Once you actually get to a target count where Maul isn't worth pressing for the damage, you now have this kind of decision where, hey, maybe there are a couple specific dangerous mobs do a lot of tank damage. I will spend these Tooth and Claw procs to gain that 50% DR against those specific mobs, even though it's a slight DPS loss, right? So you have kind of that different line of thinking now where you can kind of pick and choose whether or not you need to spend those Tooth and Claw procs, which I think really shakes up the rotation. It's useful, and I really like how it plays. Then we can talk about off healing now as a Guardian Druid, which is kind of evolved into a potential raid niche for Guardian Druid. Of course, previously Guardian Druids were kind of lacking in that department. Like, why would you bring this over any of the other Druid specs? But after these massive buffs to the ability after the Wildfire, could be something they've got. Basically, in single target situations, you're able to proc this heal about every 25 seconds, and it heals everyone within 12 yards for about 65k right now on the beta at like eye level 400, and it can even crit as well to give it some more value. So it's a pretty substantial heal. It is doing a lot of overhealing right now, usually sitting somewhere between like 70-80% overhealing when I was running it in Mythic Plus, but this is going to reduce as you do harder content, right? Harder dungeons, mythic raid bosses. It's going to be less than that most likely. It's still large though in a lot of situations. I think in the right situation though, it could be absolutely ridiculously powerful, possibly even allowing you to like drop healers entirely in a raid environment. It would require like a pretty specific situation to do this in raids. For example, you'd have to be everyone within 12 yards of the tank, and you need raid damage coming out every like 25 to 30 seconds. But that situation is not like terribly uncommon, right? It can very much exist. When it comes to AoE scenarios, you can proc this like in half the time, in 10 to 15 seconds sometimes, depending on your raid generation, right? You have Galactic Guardian, you have Blood Frenzy in Mythic Plus. Incarn kind of becomes like this healing cooldown basically, because you're just pumping out all this rage generation. You're spending your rage, you're spamming iron for whatever it is, and you're just blasting AoE healing within 12 yards. So it's kind of nuts. This does so much healing currently that you are kind of willing to drop Earth Warden in Mythic Plus, and it doesn't actually feel very bad at all, which is a bit surprising. And when you combine that with some of the other off-healing tools that Guardian has, like Nature's Vigil, for example, you can just straight up pump out extremely high healing numbers right now in the beta, which is a pretty interesting niche in my opinion to have as a tank, and I'm kind of all here for it. The defensive cooldown situation has also drastically improved after these changes. Previously, of course, you only had that one charge of Survival Instincts, but this is now kind of offset by having that Survival of the Fittest CDR in all times when you're trying to get after the Wildfire. You've got that newly buffed Rage of the Sleeper as well to help kind of fill in gaps and also provide a solid damage boost on a 1-minute cooldown. Plus, Incarn with Ursoc's Guidance is now consistently down to about a 2-minute cooldown as well, which feels really good in a lot of content, especially Mythic Plus. Once you add this to some of the earlier Guardian Druid changes, where a lot of the self-sustain and baseline power has been taken out of Incarn and baked back into the baseline spec itself with like passive DR and Scintillating Moonlight, as well as tons of passive healing from Elun's Favored, and all of a sudden, Guardian is significantly less cooldown reliant than they were late in Shadowlands, which is a big positive for me. Yes, you're not going to have those big massive bursts every 3 minutes. Incarn is nowhere near as powerful as it was in Shadowlands, but I think that is much healthier for a tank spec, because personally I was not a biggest fan of being a 3-minute hero tank spec. That kind of brings us to damage, which unsurprisingly is in a pretty good spot, as any spec probably would be after getting a 50% buff to the vast majority of their abilities. Moonfire is also no longer like 60% of our overall damage breakdown, which is much healthier for the spec. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, Maul makes up a massive portion of your damage now, particularly in single target. AoE Thrash is a much bigger portion, but single target Maul is right up there at the top. Despite this massive buff, we aren't actually miles ahead of anyone in any damage type. We were very far behind before this change, and it has kind of brought us in line to some of the other top tanks. We're still behind the Brewmasters and AoE, for example, but we're right on par with like Blood DKs and single target. So the damage is very good, but it's not insanely out of whack. The most important question here, though, in my opinion, is how does this actually all make Bear feel? First and foremost, I think it's finally a significant improvement over how the spec feels in Shadowlands. Damage boost aside, having things like the new Rage of the Sleeper, Ursoc's Guidance, a few of the Moonfire talents with their synergy, and the new Tooth and Claw, which by the way is probably my favorite talent in the entire game right now, all make the spec both play and feel a lot better than its Shadowland iteration. Now this doesn't mean that the spec is without issues. Pathing is still a massive problem in the talent tree. So many talents only have one path available to get to them, which kind of forces you to make certain decisions very early on in the tree, and you're kind of locked into those decisions. On top of that, there's pretty bad lateral movement across the entire tree. Particularly, it's very bad in the capstone level, where none of the 3 clusters down there actually connect in any way. There's also multiple full utility talents in our tree, which you're just never going to pick because they compete with throughput. There's some severely undertuned talents still on the tree, which kind of block pathing. And of course, there's just some awkward situations, like all of our rage generation being locked in the bottom right of the tree, essentially forcing you in that direction if you like having rage, which is usually good for a rage-based tank. Because of all these problems, even if Bear ends up being good in Season 1, I'd still personally like to see a pretty significant rework of our talent tree design in 10.1. Some talents need to be looked at for sure, but mainly my problems are with the tree shape, talent positioning, and pathing, and those are the things that I would like to see addressed to make the talent tree actually provide choice. As it stands, Guardian Druids are currently just ignoring the bottom left of the tree entirely, as I've talked about several times now in different videos, so I'm not going to go full detail here, but essentially you have 6 talent points now that buff Moonfire in the capstone tree, all in the bottom right, as well as all your rage generation on the right side of the tree, which makes it extremely hard to justify the opportunity cost of going towards the left side of the tree, even if there are a couple powerful or cool talents over there, which just kind of feels bad. There's really no choice or variation in the tree, and unless they buff something significantly on the left hand side to make it overpowered and broken, there's really no reason to kind of go over there, and so I don't really see a fix without some major tree changes, which just aren't going to happen before launch, right? There's no time for that. Overall, I do think Guardian is in a way better spot than they were just even a few weeks ago, both playstyle wise and tuning wise, and while I can live with the current tree for 10.0, I'm really hoping for some bigger changes in 10.1. Anyways, that's it for my thoughts on Guardian after playing it all week in Mythic Plus after the changes. What do you guys think though? Are you happy with the new Maul-based playstyle? Let me know down in the comments below. You can, of course, also check me out over on my Twitch channel at Tactics, where I stream high Mythic Plus keys, Mythic rating, and of course Dragonflight beta stuff on the weekends, all from a tank perspective. If you have any questions at all, I'd be more than happy to answer them. Otherwise, thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.